Bleach's 1000-Year Blood War arc is really the gift that keeps on giving. Every time when you think that it has peaked, it finds a way to escalate and surpass all of our expectations. If someone told me that episode 24 would start with a brand new flashback that answered questions that have plagued fans for years, I wouldn't have believed them. During the recent episode of Bleach, we received a game-changing flashback, which reveals that Ichibe had met with Yhwach 1000 years ago as they negotiate a non-aggression pact between the Quincy and the Shinigami. Now this moment brims with revelations that are nothing short of staggering. This flashback helps to fill in some gaps within the story as we learn how Yhwach had lost his The Almighty Shrift ability, and in addition to this, we learn about the scale of Yhwach's empire before he had set out to battle against the original Gotei 13. Now make sure that you stick around until the end of this video, because I'm going to be explaining how episode 24 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime has changed the lore of the Bleach universe forever. So without further delay, here is my explanation of the flashback between Yhwach and Ichibe as they discuss the terms of an agreement between the Quincy and the Shinigami in one of the best flashbacks that we've received in the all-new anime. In terms of the manga version of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, there was a multitude of unanswered questions and unresolved plot points, and highly anticipated revelations that we never ended up receiving. So when the all-new anime was first announced, a lot of people were hyped for Kubo and the anime staff to shed some light on these ambiguous areas of the final arc of Bleach. The first core, with its numerous inclusions and enhancements, had actually set our expectations quite high for the remainder of the anime, leading us to expect the later arcs of the story to receive multiple anime exclusive scenes. But I didn't expect Core 2 to answer one of the greatest questions that we've had about the 1000-Year Blood War arc at this point in the story, because we still have 2 cores left of material to adapt. I really believed that the revelations within this all new flashback would be saved for the later cores. So this anime only flashback really came as a surprise to a lot of fans. For those of you who ended up watching my review for episode 24, then you have a solid idea of how much this flashback brings to the table. But trust me when I say that I didn't even end up scratching the surface of just how deep this anime exclusive scene goes. And that's exactly why I've created a standalone video for it. So for those of you who have already seen my review of the latest Bleach episode, this is a video that you still cannot afford to miss. The true beauty of this flashback is in the way that it is able to convey true brilliance and profound depth in such a concise manner. Each frame of this all new scene brims with purpose, revealing intricate facets of the Bleach story. It's the same level of masterful visual storytelling that Kubo often implies within the manga, and you don't need to look farther than literally the first frame of this flashback in order to appreciate the depth of this flashback. The first frame features a comprehensive view of Yhwach's Empire of Light. This was Yhwach's Quincy Empire that had once existed within the world of the living. It was a massive nation whose full territory couldn't even be captured in a singular frame, as we witness what appears to be merely the citadel, suggesting that the entirety of the Empire of Light is even grander in its scale. The first thing that comes to mind is that Yhwach wasn't just a small-time king in the middle of nowhere. He actually ruled a grand empire that could have easily been mistaken for the Soul Society due to how massive it was. This reminder, however, turns painfully sour when we realize that this was not only the empire that Yhwach had ruled over, but it was also the one that he had tragically lost. From what we see here, you can easily estimate that thousands of people were living in Yhwach's empire, and a good number of those individuals were not Quincy soldiers. They were just civilians who became casualties in the war between the Shinigami and the Quincy. Additionally, the Empire of Light isn't unfamiliar to us. Observant fans will recognize Yhwach's castle Silburn as the centerpiece of the Empire of Light. Both the manga and the anime offer multiple glimpses of this structure. A side-by-side comparison of the two images, you would easily notice that they are the exact same building. This would most likely mean that the Quincy cityscape that replaces the Soul Society during the second invasion of the Quincy is that of the Empire of Light. This frozen ghost city is all that is left of Yhwach's empire, an empire that was so great that Ichibe and the Shinigami had resorted to peace talks with them. After the Quincy cityscape replaces the Serete, you'll notice that not a single soul outside of the Soldat and the Sternritter end up living within Silburn. This means that aside from Yhwach's army, pretty much every single civilian guardian who had lived within the Empire of Light had ended up dying, which adds a whole new layer of tragedy to what the Quincy had to go through. So it's after this very first frame of the flashback that we enter the castle in order to find Ichibe and a much younger Yhwach having a discussion. I'd like to take a minute to talk about how fantastically drawn Yhwach is during this whole flashback. He looks exactly like Old Man Zangetsu, but strangely enough, he is depicted so differently that he still feels like a completely different character, which I can attribute to the amazing work of the animation team and Yhwach's voice actor, Mr. Takayuki Sugo, whose fantastic performance shows us this all-new side of Yhwach. Now, delving into the dialogue between Ichibe and Yhwach, Ichibe refers to himself as the balancer of the three realms. The three realms, of course, refer to the world of the living, the Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo. Now, this role of the balancer is something that we haven't really heard of before, but taking into consideration that Ichibe lives to protect the status quo, it makes perfect sense that he would hold this position. So in a sense, Ichibe is the ultimate line of defense against any threat to the stability of the three worlds. It is his role as the balancer that, in my opinion, perfectly explains why he had to be the one to go and speak to Yhwach. This is because Yhwach's goals far extended beyond just war with the Soul Society. His goal was to undo reality itself, and if anyone could pull this goal off, then it would definitely be Yhwach, as is demonstrated during Bleach's final arc. So for the sake of how much of a threat that he had posed to the three worlds, it would make sense that its guardian was the one who had stepped in order to negotiate terms of a non-aggression pact between the Quincy and the Shinigami, instead of someone like Yamamoto. Now, getting into the details of the agreement, Ichibe suggests a ceasefire between the Soul Society and the Empire of Light, as he tells Yhwach to leave the realms of reality to the Shinigami to take care of, and Yhwach can then enjoy the prosperity of his empire unimpeded by the Shinigami. He even adds that they won't interfere with his attempt to unify the two Quincy groups under the Empire of Light. This is a statement that is loaded with very fascinating implications. It first of all ties perfectly into Bazby's flashback, where his family's castle is destroyed as a result of Yhwach's conquest. This means that despite leading a massive empire, Yhwach didn't rule over all of the Quincy. There were other Quincy nations and territories that were against Yhwach's ways, which is why Yhwach had to wage war on them in order to capture their territories, and it is during these clashes with other Quincy nations which had resulted in the destruction of Bazby's family home. From this revelation, it begs the question of just how many Quincy nations there were at the time. What were their philosophies? What was the cultural differences between these different groups of Quincy? And what is possibly the greatest question raised by this is that if Yhwach is the father of all Quincy, then how are there different factions amongst them? Especially if Yhwach is believed to be the one who had started it all. This is an idea present in both the anime and the manga, and I cannot wait to see what answers will be given, because from the duration of the Bleach narrative, we do see another example of Quincy via Soken Ishida's traditional Quincy teachings, which reveals an entirely different philosophy and methodology to the Quincy race, which contradicts the way that Yhwach's Quincy operate. Now, coming back to the flashback, Ichibe explains that if Yhwach is to leave the protection of the world to the Shinigami, then all of his conquests and pretty much any of his affairs will be overlooked by the Shinigami. Now, to any selfish villain whose goal is to amass as much power as possible, this would have been a very enticing offer to accept. But this is where we're shown a completely different side to Yhwach's character, one that was actually implied to be present in the manga but was never fully shown to us. Yhwach surprisingly disagrees and calls the offer a deception. He even asks Ichibe if he believes him to be some sort of an ignorant child who knows nothing about the world. Ichibe then responds that while he's not trying to be disrespectful to him, it is true that Yhwach truly knows nothing. Yhwach ignores Ichibe's insult and begins to ask the monk a series of questions. He asks Ichibe that when the worlds were once one, who was it that had interrupted the peace by separating the concepts of life and death? Who was it that had brought the fear of death to the people? Ichibe confidently responds to both of these questions by revealing that it was the Soul King who apparently had done this. One thing that I absolutely love about how the anime handles this section of the conversation is that it relies on the audience already knowing the true answer to the question that Yhwach is asking him. Because if you have read the Can't For Your Own World light novels and you know about the truth of the Soul King, then it makes the lies that Ichibe states here feel that much more impactful. When Ichibe is answering the first question, we get a close-up, heavily shaded shot of Ichibe's face as he states that it was the Soul King, a scene that perfectly conveys the shamelessness in his words. He's technically right that it was the Soul King who created the current world, but he's ignoring the fact that it was himself and the ancestors of the noble families who had used the Soul King's power against his will in order to create the three realms. Ichibe hides behind the presumed authority of the Soul King in order to justify the existence of the current worlds, despite being the one directly responsible for having created them. He tries to use his lies in order to shut down whatever argument Yhwach would have against the existence of these three realms. But Yhwach challenges Ichibe as he answers that he has known the pained cries of all of the souls that he has absorbed, and he knows the vindictiveness of those who fear death and cling on to their lives. He asks Ichibe that in the face of all of their pain and suffering, is this the answer that he is going to give them? That things are the way they are because the Soul King said so? I cannot praise the genius of this scene enough. Yhwach's response does two major things here. The first is what it does for his characterization. On an argumentative level, Yhwach bringing up the actual suffering of souls in the current world completely shatters Ichibe's facade. Ichibe hides behind the idea of the world existing as it is because the Soul King had willed it to be this way, hence bashing his entire argument for its validity on an appeal to authority. Yhwach's response forces him to come out of hiding behind that premise and to make an actual defense for the world as it is if people are suffering within it. This essentially ends the conversation because Ichibe is incapable of making such a defense. He's essentially been put on the spot in a manner that forces him to acknowledge that Yhwach has a point. This is why things immediately escalate after Yhwach says this, because Ichibe realizes that Yhwach was never going to take his offer because his goals extend far beyond that of conquest. The second major role that this conversation plays is what it does for Yhwach as a character. By this point in the manga, it's already been revealed that any and all souls who died during the war would have their souls absorbed by Yhwach. This reveal addresses how Yhwach becomes more powerful, but there was another side to this that was hinted at in chapter 565, which was that a soul's entire existence, including their memories, powers, and abilities, would be engraved onto the soul fragment that returns to Yhwach. This meant that Yhwach wasn't just learning to fight better from those memories, Yhwach was also experiencing all of the pain, suffering, and regrets that those souls had carried with them. And when you consider how long Yhwach has been alive for, and how many hundreds of millions of souls have returned to him in that time, you realize that he was carrying the baggage and trauma of entire generations, which is just horrifying to imagine. Now, after considering how he needs to keep absorbing souls to maintain his existence, it becomes evident that he doesn't have much of a choice but to keep feeding on these souls and their suffering. The way that Kubo creates this situation around this antagonist is absolutely poetic. Ichibe is unable to respond and instead tells Yhwach not to mention his name so casually. This is also a really cool setup for when Ichibe tells him again in the present. Yhwach then asks him if there's any place in these three realms where the souls can find peace. Ichibe and Yhwach both answer at the same time, with Yhwach saying that he can see it, and Ichibe saying that he will show him. Yhwach then opens his eyes, revealing that he has activated the Almighty, and at the same time Ichibe extends his hands towards Yhwach and seems to be activating some sort of power. This standoff is interrupted by Yhwach's guards Hubert, Argola, Zedrit, and an unknown Quincy girl. They had been standing in the hall by Yhwach's side the entire time and had moved in order to protect their king the moment that they had felt that he was in danger. This particular Quincy girl has really made waves within the community for quite a number of reasons, but what I find to be the most interesting thing about her is the weapon that she is using. This Quincy has a gun as her spirit weapon, as we literally see her creating it out of her reishi before she begins to shoot at Ichibe. There's of course the glaring issue of how a gun existed more than 1,000 years before the current era, but in hindsight I do think that this is a very clever detail that Kubo has included. Kubo has explained on Club Outside that he directed the entire flashback sequence, which is probably why it feels so much like Kubo's work, so I'm quite certain that this was an intentional inclusion on his part. But how does this fit within the timeline of Bleach? Well, I believe that this scene isn't supposed to fit in with a timeline, because if you consider Yhwach to be an individual who can see into the distant future with his power, the Almighty, then it makes perfect sense that he would be able to use his ability to equip his people with power and weaponry that he has seen in the future. This would immediately put his soldiers above the competition. It is definitely part of the reason why Yhwach's empire was so dominant amongst the Quincy. In addition to Yhwach's incredible power, they were also literally ahead of their time. This is further supported by how the architecture of the Empire of Light feels very different to what we can expect from a world from 1,000 years ago. If anything, the Empire of Light's architecture is very similar to what we have in the modern age, in comparison to the the type of architecture that would have been around 1,000 years ago. These additional pieces of information reveal why Yhwach was such an effective wartime leader, as well as a master strategist. Now, if you've come into this video after watching my review, then you'll remember that I had spoken about how this flashback scene creates some very interesting implications about Yhwach's empire and his branch of Quincy. Well, to go further into this point, this idea of Yhwach bringing the world of the future to the present of his people would explain why his Quincy's have no issue with using a variety of weapons. It was originally believed that Yhwach's branch of Quincy developed completely new fighting styles after they had retreated to the shadow dimension, and that was the explanation for why they fought so differently from the traditional Quincy that we know of. But this flashback throws all of this to the wayside and confirms that Yhwach's branch of Quincy have already been accustomed to using alternative weaponry at least 1,000 years before the present timeline. This isn't just some anime exclusive retcon, this idea is even present in the manga. During Bazby's flashback in chapter 632, we see Hubert wielding a sword. He even draws this very sword in the flashback as well, and when Bazby describes Yhwach in the flashback, he calls him a monster who took over the world without a bow and arrow, but instead with mysterious powers, once again confirming that Yhwach and his army didn't use bow and arrows, but instead an assortment of different kinds of weaponry. This implies that Yhwach has very interesting applications for his Shrift ability, the Almighty. The fact that all of this can be deduced from simply showing us a girl with a gun is the perfect illustration of Kubo's masterful storytelling. His ability to say so much with just one image is why I'm so deeply enthralled by his work. Now, after the Quincy girl begins to shoot at Ichibe and all of her bullets are stopped by a mysterious barrier that Ichibe creates, her bullets are frozen in midair before being shot right back at her. She's saved by Hugo, who jumps in front of them and covers them with his body. Ichibe then focuses his attention on Yhwach, where we then see an eye open on the palm of his hand. The eye has two separate irises, very similar to Yhwach's almighty eyes. The opening of the eyes comes with a massive shockwave of spiritual pressure that engulfs Yhwach. Yuha then begins to have visions, glimpses of what was done to the Soul King by Ichibe and the ancestors of the 5 great noble families. These visions are exactly the same as what Ichigo had seen within Irazu Sando, with one added vision. We get an extremely sinister shot of Ichibe holding the now desecrated corpse of the Soul King, as it appears as though he is raising him out of the water. The shot then zooms further to show Ichibe's extremely dark silhouette and eerily glowing eyes, and this is where the vision ends. After Yhwach sees all this, he appears to be visibly shocked as he asks himself if what he has just seen was the Soul King. Ichibe responds that he was right in saying Yhwach had known nothing, adding that he is working together with the Soul King in order to protect this fragile world. There's something deeply disturbing about Ichibe's words. He almost sounds as though the current state of the world was created by a collaborative effort between themselves and the Soul King, when in actuality he was merely used as a tool in order to create reality the way that Ichibe and the ancestors of the noble families had wanted. Yuha sits quietly processing everything that he has just seen as blood vein marks begin to appear on his face and body. He appears to be saddened by the visions that he has had, but it quickly turns into explosive anger as he expresses his disgust at the Shinigami before him. Yuha moves so quickly that even Ichibe is caught by surprise as he grabs his pointed arm, which is of course the same arm that has conjured up that eyeball. Yuha reminds Ichibe that he had told him that he can see everything, and asks him if he thinks that he can kill him with just that hand. While he is speaking, the blood vein pattern begins to spread onto Ichibe's left arm. Yuha then reveals to him that hand is merely his father's sacrifice to his child, and it cannot be used to take life but only give it. Now there's a lot packed into this last section, as Ichibe responds that Yhwach has really troublesome eyes, but they can't see through the Soul King. The hand Yhwach was holding quickly deforms and turns into a giant hand version of itself that wraps around Yhwach and disappears. This forcibly deactivates Yhwach's almighty, and Yuha is left confused. Ichibe then asks him if he had really thought that he was going to let him have the Soul King's arm for free, as he then gets up and begins to walk away. He tells Yuha that his eyes will remain closed until the day that he dies, and to add insult to injury, he savagely tells him to live a modest life from now on. So what on earth really happened here towards the end of this flashback? Well, from how I interpret these events, it appears as though Ichibe has brought the left arm of the Soul King with him when he had come to speak with Yhwach. This is of course the same arm that we later come to know as Pranida, but I'll come back to this point in just a second. How Ichibe had even used the left arm of the Soul King is is an extremely interesting detail. He seems to have merged it with his own arm and as such could freely control its powers. This is actually nowhere near as unprecedented as some fans may believe it to be, as it's already been shown to be possible for individuals to use the body parts of the Soul King as their own. The first example of this is Ukitake, who's in possession of Mimihagi, and literally an entire race of humans who possess Soul King fragments in their bodies called Fullbringers. Among them are characters like Ora Michibane, who inherited the Soul King's Sakatsu, and other Fullbringers who also possess some fragments of the Soul King's body, and not to mention the Stenrita Gremi, who possesses the brain of the Soul King. This means that using the Soul King's body parts to exhibit some of the power is something pretty much any race can do, since even hollows like Iko Mikidomo can even gain power from consuming Soul King fragments. This is why Ichibe being able to do this is in no way a surprise and is quite consistent with everything that we know about the Soul King's body parts and how they have been used within the narrative. Ichibe also manifests another ability in his right arm that has led some fans into thinking that he possessed Mimihagi also. Governing the concept of stagnation, it is what Ichibe uses to halt the progression of the bullets and send them back to where they had come from. But while this theory is quite plausible, there just isn't a lot of evidence to support it. So it's difficult to tell if this isn't just another one of Ichibe's many mysterious abilities instead of a manifestation of Mimihagi's power. But what we do know for certain is that Ichibe had tried to use the left hand's power against Yhwach, as I want to now try to understand what exactly it ended up doing. Ichibe activates his power at the same time as the Almighty. I think that he did this as a means of countering the Almighty, since it will be explained that Yhwach's Almighty cannot foresee the actions of the Soul King or his sentient body parts, which is why later on in the story when Mimihagi appears, it genuinely takes Yhwach by surprise. And it's why the moment that Pernaida's eyes open, he appears to not see the future anymore, but rather receive visions about the past. This kind of results in Ichibe's plan of blocking the power of the Almighty to backfire on him because he had unintentionally given information away to his enemy, because Yhwach was unaware of what had been done to the Soul King before Pernaida had shown it to him. And it seems that Pernaida has communicated other things to Yhwach, which is why Yhwach understood its true nature and purpose. Yhwach understood that despite Ichibe's malicious intentions behind bringing the arm, its power could never be used to kill Yhwach and was rather meant to be a sacrifice from a father to his son. Yuha then uses Blutvin in order to invade Ichibe's body and to claim the left hand of the Soul King for himself. Now it seems as though Ichibe did have one more card to play, as he states that despite Yhwach's troublesome eyes, he still couldn't see through the Soul King, which leads me to believe that despite gaining new knowledge from Pernaida's visions, Yhwach still hadn't understood the will of the Soul King, and that there was a catch to receiving Pernaida, which appears to be that Yhwach would lose the powers of his Shrift after gaining the left hand of the Soul King. Now how exactly this seal was created is a bit of a mystery, and it leads me to believe that it was also the Soul King's will and power at work here which made it possible for Yhwach's eyes to be sealed. We can also add that Yhwach was most likely yet to master the powers of the Almighty, which helps to explain why it was so easily sealed away. This scene explains how Yhwach was able to gain the left arm of the Soul King on his side, and contrary to popular belief, I don't believe that Yhwach's Blutvin touching the left arm of the Soul King is how it had come onto the side of the Quincy, because I believe that it was a Quincy from the moment that it was cut off from the Soul King's body, and it appears as though this was part of the information that was relayed by Pernaida to Yhwach, as Yhwach knows that the power of Pernaida could never kill him because the Soul King had planned it as a sacrifice for his son. So it appears as though the Soul King had imparted different aspects of his will into his different body parts. Mimihagi, the arm of stagnation, was given the will to protect the world that the Shinigami had created. As its title as the arm of stagnation suggests, it exists to prevent the world from changing, whereas Pernaida is the arm of progress, so it makes perfect sense that it serves the side that wants the world to change. I'm just really happy that we get further expansions upon this really deep concept surrounding the Soul King, as we're beginning to reach the point of the story where characters like Gerard, Mimihagi and Pernaida are going to become more central to the narrative. After Ichibe leaves, Yuha is seated at his table by himself. Firstly, he states that he is grateful for losing his eyes so he doesn't have to see through his father's humiliation any longer. It's evident that his encounter with Ichibe had made him understand the truth behind what was done to his father. It is with this in mind that he promises himself that he would save his father from the eternal shame that he's been subjected to. He promises that he will erase him along with the world, and that his existence will serve as a gravestone for the three realms that he's currently supporting. This appears to be the moment that he starts working towards the goal that we currently see him acting upon. This this scene also marks the end of the flashback, which brings me to the final part of this analysis, which is everything that this flashback scene in particular reveals about Yhwach's character. Even on a superficial level, it is evident that this flashback expands upon Yhwach's character in a very fascinating way, starting from how Yhwach is depicted in this flashback, as we're shown a completely new side of his character. In the manga, Yhwach suffered from what I'd like to call omniscient villain syndrome. This trope characterizes a villain as virtually impossible, always several steps ahead and unfazed, having preemptively accounted for every possible twist in the story. While initially intriguing, such a one-dimensional trait can lose its appeal very quickly, which ultimately results in a lot of fans having critiques about Yhwach's character. However, this flashback scene in particular upends this perspective by showcasing Yhwach in a totally new light. Remarkably, the Yhwach that we see now isn't the omnipotent puppeteer, but rather a student of circumstance, revealing a very rare and vulnerable moment for his character. His emotions range from sorrow to bewilderment, painting him more as a tormented soul than the perceived tyrant that he is revealed to be in the final arc. This one-time, all-knowing antagonist is presented in an individual who is lost in his own thoughts, as it's obvious that he wants to end the suffering of humans when we learn that he understands the fear of death that they all have. This information really recontextualizes his character in a lot of ways. It should come as no surprise that Yhwach has actually gained a massive group of not only fans but supporters, people who believe that he deserves to win, which is a fantastic place for a villain to be in the eyes of the audience. Now, there's a moral greyness to this war that creates the perfect grounds for some compelling storytelling, and it's all thanks to how Yhwach now feels like more of an empathetic character and has started to pave his way towards becoming a generally recognized villain. Of course, I've always known Yhwach was a fantastic character, and I've been Team Yhwach since day one, so I'm just glad that the anime is making his greatness even more evident for everyone to see. Finally, there's one more thing that this flashback scene does for Yhwach's character, and this point in particular actually blew my mind. I just talked about how it put him in a much more empathetic light, but there's more to it. It seems as though within this conversation, Yhwach discovers the truth about what had been done to his father. This is when he makes up his mind to destroy the three realms and end his father's humiliation, and it raises just a single question. Before that, what was Yhwach fighting for? Because Yhwach at the time wasn't seeking to end the world because his father was suffering, because he finds this out during the meeting. At the start of the meeting, Yhwach's only argument against the current state of the world was the suffering of souls, and I find this to be really touching, that Yhwach was so tormented by human suffering that he had opted to end the world just so that it would stop. This speaks volumes about his character, and honestly, I've only come to love him more after this scene in episode 24. This flashback really is a sign for things to come, and it's quite impressive how so much information was packed into this 4-minute long flashback scene. If these are the kinds of expansions that we're going to be getting going into Core 3 and 4, then the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime is in safe hands, and Bleach fans are really in for a treat with some of the surprises that Kubo and the anime staff are preparing. So now we've reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What did you think about this amazing flashback sequence from episode 24? Are you as excited about it as I am? And are you looking forward to similar anime-only inclusions like this going into the final 2 seasons of the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime? I look forward to reading all of your thoughts, and lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video. I tried really hard to cook this video up before the finale of Core 2, so I hope that you appreciate this quick upload before we review the final part of Core 2. So yeah, I look forward to seeing all of you in my review, which I'll be uploading as soon as possible on the weekend. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.